Hello, and welcome to Ethics on Call, the podcast of the Center for Theology and Ethics in Catholic Health. I'm Dan Daly.
Hi, I'm Tom Bushlack.
And today we'll take up the issue of caring for our immigrant brothers and sisters in a time of fear. And today we'll have an extended interview with Dr. Mark Kuczewski, a thought leader in the ethics of providing healthcare for immigrants, including persons who are undocumented. And, Tom, before you introduce Mark, I'd like to raise up a quote that Mark actually includes in one of the articles that we read in preparation for this interview. And he quotes St. John Paul II, who wrote, "Attention must be called to the rights of migrants and their families, and to respect for their human dignity, even in cases of non-legal immigration," end quote. And so what Mark does in his work is really invites us to consider how we live out John Paul's call to respect the dignity of all immigrants, even those who are here in our country who do not have legal status, that their dignity is not diminished by their legal status. And so we really have to take that seriously. We have to take John Paul's call to the rights and dignity of even people who have non-legally immigrated to our country. And Mark has been an incredibly important and powerful advocate in that way.
Yeah, and this is not a new issue in the tradition, right? It goes. I mean, it really goes back to the Hebrew prophets, right? Of welcoming the widow, the orphan, and the stranger. The stranger is, could be translated as the foreigner residing in your midst, the immigrant, the migrant. And as many of our listeners know, back in November of 2025, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops issued a special message on immigration where they reaffirmed their call, and it's a direct quote, for a meaningful reform of our nation's immigration laws and procedures, end quote. And then they conclude that pastoral letter, by stating, again, a direct quote, "We oppose the indiscriminate mass deportation of people. We pray for an end to dehumanizing rhetoric and violence, whether directed at immigrants or at law enforcement." So ending that quote. So again, I think Mark just does a great job of embodying a nonviolent prophetic witness in a way that it calls forth our higher values. And again, his words and his writings and what he shares with us in the interview provides some really helpful ways for those of us who work in Catholic healthcare to consider how to live out those words that you quoted from St. John Paul II and I quoted from the USCCB, and advocate for our immigrant brothers and sisters. So we're going to get into the interview here in a second. Just a quick kind of bio. Dr. Mark Kuczewski is the Father Michael English Professor of Medical Ethics at Loyola University Chicago, where he's also the director of the Neiswanger Institute for Bioethics and Health Policy. He's also the past president of the American Society for Bioethics and in the Humanities, ASBH, and is a fellow at the Hastings Center, which is one of the largest bioethics think tanks in the country. Currently, his interests include attention to the role of culture in spirituality and decision-making. And this has led him to particular interest in the bioethical issues related to the recent controversies over immigrant status in the United States. So we're going to jump into our conversation with Dr. Mark Kuczewski. Well, welcome to Ethics on Call, Mark. We really appreciate you taking the time to be here with us and our listeners.
Pleasure to be here. Thank you.
Yeah. So kind of a general question to get us started. How did you become interested in the work of immigrants' experiences in the healthcare system? And how did you kind of get into the work that you've been doing?
Well, thanks again for having me, Dan and Tom. I am a bioethicist for a long time. I work at Loyola Stritch School of Medicine, and we work in the med school, but we consult over in the hospital. And before I got to Loyola, I was consulting in hospitals. In the early 2000s, we started to see increasing numbers of cases that involved young immigrants, usually undocumented. It's a typical one that I recall quite vividly. Young male construction worker suffered a workplace injury. He was sent to our hospital, and he was stabilized, but he had pretty severe back injury and needed significant rehabilitation care after he left our hospital. And the hospital wanted to send him for rehab to recover his functionality, but they couldn't because being undocumented, he had no health insurance. And acute care hospitals have to take everybody in when they present through the law that's called EMTALA. But once you're stabilized, no other kind of facility, like a rehab facility, would have to take this patient if they're uninsured. And he wasn't eligible for the typical safety net mechanisms that would kick in from the states, like Medicaid or something like that, that might be able to send him to a facility like that. And so he was just stuck in the hospital. And so they call ethics and start asking questions like, can we put him on a plane and send him back to the country where he came from originally? And I remember being a little distressed by that and thinking, that doesn't sound fair. It doesn't sound right. And eventually I did some research, and my first article in this area was actually on against forced medical repatriation.
Mm.
But the unfairness of it struck me. Here's a young man came here working hard, had lived here for a fair number of years, literally building our country, and yet there, came time to when he was sick and he needed a little support. He needed rehab. He needed to be able to recover his functionality and go back to work. And instead, there's talk of putting him on a plane and just shipping him out with no real respect for the person. And so this started to bother me, and I started to get interested in it. And but there's always personal reasons why particular issues resonate with you, right? Why we don't just write our chart note, finish the case, and move on. And for me, it really was that something about this went bump against my personal ideas of being a person who's in America and the land of opportunity, and being what it means to be an immigrant here. My mother was raised in Portugal. She was born here, but went back. Her family went back to Portugal when she was young, and she was raised there. Didn't have much of an opportunity for education during the Great Depression in rural Portugal. She only got a third grade education. And my father, was the son of immigrants, and all. He worked in the coal mines and had to quit school to work in the mines, and couldn't get an education. And so I was raised in a family that was hardworking, but we called working poor. But I had great ambitions. Being a kid, I liked the books and I wanted to go to college, and I had all kinds of things I used to talk about when I was a little kid, maybe go to law school, maybe do this or that. And I remember talking like this one time. I was about 9 or 10, and my mother just looking at me and saying, yeah, Mark, things like that aren't for people like us.
Mm.
And I remember, you know, I could still remember that feeling I got. I can feel it right now, that almost like I was going to pass out. People like us, what does that mean? This is America. I remember my thoughts going, this is America. I read about people like Abe Lincoln and Harry Truman and these poor boys who studied hard and worked hard, and they became something. They became important. And thinking like, what do you mean people like us can't do that? And that feeling, like it stuck with me for while I was growing up until I eventually got to college. That in fact, me in America, you could do something like that. You could get ahead. There always aren't differences among people. It's who you are and what you do that counts in America. Your character. And somehow these stories that I was seeing in the hospital of these young people, sometimes called dreamers, undocumented young people, were being raised here, or came here at very young ages, working hard, and somehow they were being treated like people like them. They were shut out. And that just resonated to me as terribly unfair. And so I kind of became obsessed with these issues.
Mm. Well, I really appreciate the connection you made there between like there's the direct care of the patient that you experienced, and that then it's from asking those questions that come out of that experience that lead into the work of advocacy in a more public or prophetic type voice. And I think we need those kinds of stories in our current climate, because nothing about what you said is political in the sense of it's political small p, but not capital P, right? In terms of our current two-party system or whatever. It's just you could say it's personalist, or it's based in that dignity of the people that you've interacted with. So yeah,
Right. It's
yeah,
basic relating to another human being, right? And
yeah,
seeing the similarities rather than the differences. Many differences between that young construction worker and me, but more similarities than differences, right? That's what it means to be, the fellowship of human beings.
yeah. And that's a choice. That's a moral choice that you've made, and that Catholic healthcare as a whole challenges us to make. So thank you for sharing.
Exactly.
Yeah. So you've written in some of your articles about sanctuary doctoring as a needed practice during this time, probably before this time, but even more so now. So can you describe what that sanctuary doctrine is?
Sure. We created a website, a toolkit, myself and two physicians here, Dr. Amy Blair, who's in our Department of Family Medicine, and Dr. Johanna Mejias Beck, who's an alum of the Stritch School of Medicine, and as a med-peds physician down in Kansas City, Missouri now. And we created this toolkit, under the name Sanctuary Doctrine. The word sanctuary gets pilloried a lot in the public square these days, but it's Latin for holy, right? Holy, that word sanctus, holy. And doctoring, in some ways, saying sanctuary doctoring is redundant because, in a way, doctoring is a holy task. It's a distinctively human task to care for another human being in a very intimate way when they're sick and vulnerable. And so this toolkit was created. I think we put it up first in 2017 to deal with the concerns, the immigration-related concerns that patients had that could be affecting their health. First off, if they're very concerned about their immigration status and being picked up, they might be afraid to come in for care, and they put off care till they're really sick and it's an emergency and the outcomes are worse and it's much more costly to treat them. And also that there's just the toxic stress of having concerns about their immigration status or family members' immigration status and not knowing what to do and feeling they can't talk to anybody about that. It creates a kind of toxic stress makes us sick. And so this is a website of information and resources to help people, help physicians talk to their patients. And now we have wallet cards that people can use that they can scan the QR code on it and give the card to the patient who scans that, goes right to the site and gives them basic information that can help them address their immigration concerns. So the idea is to empower patients, not to hide, not to avoid these issues, but to actually directly address their concerns. And so the physicians can assure them that many people have these concerns. We kind of coach the physician at the site to, help people understand they're not alone, that there are ways to address things, to give them referrals to legal resources, to information for emergency planning, so they can take charge of their situation should they be detained, and their children, their emergency contacts are updated, their children's schools, so children go to the right people if the parent is sidelined and detained. And so this whole idea of sanctuary doctoring is that the physician's office is a safe place to address these concerns. And the physician can give them simple resources to give, not overwhelm them with resources, but a very simple couple links so they can find an immigration attorney from the website and things like that. And I should say very much up front right away, somehow when I start talking about this, there's always an assumption that somebody makes that, in fact, I'm talking about doing something illegal. Nothing I ever say has anything to do with telling people to do something illegal. We want people to treat their patients to the really to the best of their ability, but to the fullest extent of the law. That's what we're talking about here. Not something illegal, but people hear illegal immigrants. They sometimes use that pejorative term, and they think that somehow you must be doing something illegal by associating with them. And Pope Francis cautioned us in that last letter he sent to the U.S. bishops about a month before his death: don't identify having an unauthorized immigration status with criminality. That's a mistake we make.
Yeah. Well,
Mark, it's a great program, for formation for physicians and also information for patients. And you kind of got at my question was going to lead in the direction of how has this been received? Again, given the language you're using of sanctuary doctoring, and I think you acquitted it very well, the language that you've chosen. What's been the reception of folks in the
Oh,
public
you know,
on this?
it's funny you should ask that, Dan, because the reception has changed over time.
Mm.
When we first put it up around 2017, we really the key things we had on the website were that health systems could download were these patient flyers that they could download and put in exam rooms that had all the information to help the patients address their situation. And patients could take it while they're sitting waiting in the exam room and look at it. And we always had told physicians put it in the exam room because you put it out in the public area, they'll sit there till they rot. Patients don't want to grab that in front of people. But in the exam rooms, they flew off the shelves. And the health system, several of them, not only received those brochures, well, they asked if they could put their own branding on it and things like that. And we were all for that. We didn't copyright it. We said, brand it up, use it, put your own stamp on it, and put local resources in there along with the national resources we had listed. And it was really quite well received. I will say that in the last year, health systems are very, very gun shy about having this kind of material laying around in their waiting rooms. They really just don't want it to be seen or to be questioned about it. They feel somehow they may be poking the bear and create some kind of backlash for themselves. And so that's why we created the wallet cards right away, so that physicians could carry the wallet cards right in their pockets and hand them directly to patients rather than have something laying around. And physicians and other healthcare providers, nurses, social workers, have really been asking for them. And we give those out absolutely free of charge if we're asked. We just send you a stack of them, all you can use. But it is meant to be, now it is more covert, actually. There is less overt support being put out there, laying around in the spaces that are our clinics and our exam rooms.
Yeah, we can put a link to that in the show notes for anybody listening that wants to check that out. And just to close the loop on that whole part of the conversation, something I appreciated about your work and reading it is that you directly link immigration status to that broader conversation about social determinants of health, and that truly is a factor. And if you don't have protected legal status, a detriment to health overall. Um,
Indeed. Indeed, you could see how many ways it affects your health status, right? Because, if you're undocumented, it's difficult to have health insurance. Now, mind you, about 50% of undocumented immigrants do have health insurance. That still means 50% do not. That's a very high percentage. So there's the difficulty accessing the system because of lack of insurance. And then there's barriers of fear that create problems of coming in. And so there are all sorts of ways in which and the stress involved that affects healthcare and affects one's health status, I should say. And so immigration status is a social influencer of health. There is no doubt about it.
So, Mark, your work seems to move between the different ethical forms of discourse that, some of our listeners, if you really studied theological ethics, you'll remember the renowned ethicist and theologian James Gustafson, renowned Protestant theologian and ethicist. And he identified these four different modes of ethical discourse: the narrative discourse that describes the ethics of a community, ethical analytic discourse that gets at action guidance and using ethical reasoning. When we think about like the doing of ethics, we often think of analytic ethics, policy ethics and promoting the good in the political sphere, and then prophetic, a prophetic form of discourse where it's about indictment of injustice and then kind of a visionary perspective of the way that things should be. And it seems to me your work is moving between a lot of these. And in an article you just published in January of 2026, entitled "This Year's Bioethicist: From Influencer to Prophetic Educator," and we'll link this article in the show notes, you call on the bioethicists to be more prophetic. And so my question is, what do you think, what does that look like for you? What do you think bioethicists should be doing? And why is this a year for prophecy?
Yeah, great question, Dan. And as you say, that subtitle in that article starts from influencer to prophetic educator. And I do think that the role of the clinical ethicist in particular, bioethicists who work with health systems, has been largely that of an influencer. We're not radicals of some sort. The problems arise in our hospital. If you just go back to the beginning of the end of life decisions that were being made in the 70s and 80s, when for the first time we were talking about being able to forego death delaying treatments in favor of comfort care. And the idea of taking a ventilator off seemed so uncomfortable to people. And they're sort of the bioethicists like Kevin O'Rourke coming from theology, came into this sphere and became clinical ethicists and actually helped health systems and health professionals to navigate these dilemmas in ways that they could put into policy and make comfortable, and take things that were very dramatic and gut-wrenching and make them routine in some ways, make them more amenable to the clinical setting, so that it wasn't a source of conflict all the time, but in fact could work out solutions and approaches and protocols that respected everybody's interests in this, the healthcare professionals as well as the patients and their families. And we've usually become pretty popular in many ways with administrators and health system leaders, because we're not seen as radicals. We're seen, who go rogue. We're seen as people who work with them to try to help them honor their goals as health care professionals, as healthcare institutions, in a way that is not that actually solves problems for them rather than creates them. And so that influencer thing has been a nice role for us, and we're occasionally able to nudge and push people to go an extra mile, And so, with things like health equity, we've often been parts of teams that have helped push for health systems to take more, to do more programs that actually produce more health equity and help people who are not well served by the system. So, we're not protesting the streets. We're working with, our leaders and teams. But you're right, times have changed a little bit. And part of what I think is happening, just going back to that example of not wanting to put something as simple as a brochure for an undocumented patient in an exam room anymore. There's a fear that is causing people to retract a little bit, to pull back from things that we would have considered just part of their ordinary caregiving protocol. And so, when I go to that word prophetic, I'm often talking about, the prophets of old who called to the people and said, "You've wandered from your path, the path that was your tradition, the path that set you right with God. You've wandered away from that, and I'm calling you back to that." And so when I talk about the bioethicists as being prophetic educators, I'm talking about them, reminding them, and, as I do at the beginning of every talk I do on immigration for healthcare professionals, I say, this is not about politics. This is about who you are as healthcare professionals. This is about your values of caring for the patient in an efficient way that respects their dignity and produces the best for them and our community. And so trying to remind them those values, saying, come back to those values, ground yourself in those, remember those, and then the rest follows a little bit more easily. And so it's about calling them back to what they knew in the past. But of course, with the prophet, a new future emerges from that too, right? Once you come back to that, because times have changed. If you come back to those values, what's going to happen might look a little different.
Yeah, it also makes me think that there are some real tensions between these different modes. You're talking about the influencer mode and then the prophetic mode, or we can think about Gustafson's categories like the policy mode and the prophetic mode. Because the policy mode is really pragmatic. It's the mode of compromise. It's kind of takes a realist uh, perspective on these things. Whereas, the prophetic mode is really calls out the unjust actions of individuals and groups, calls those people to conversion, as we see in the Old Testament and in other places. And it really isn't interested in compromise. The prophet isn't interested in compromising the values, as you just noted. But the prophet is often sidelined from the rooms where decisions are made, or is rejected. We don't have to look too far into the Old Testament prophets to see the sufferings that they endure for their prophecy. When you start to call out injustice in a society, you're often, you're seen as a gadfly that needs to be sidelined. And so, you know, I know that bioethicists and clinical ethicists are dealing with these tensions between the kind of the influencer mode, the policy mode, the prophetic mode. How do you navigate those tensions as a bioethicist?
Yeah, and there's not a simple formula for it, but you do have to navigate them carefully and with as much and prayerfully and with as much practical wisdom as you can muster. Because on the one hand, as you say, we do not want to give up that role as of influencers. We don't want to be completely left out of the rooms where these discussions take place and change can happen. If we do that, then obviously, and sometimes it happens. Sometimes, the people we're working with are so fearful that they'd rather just deal with this in a way that uh, complies with what they need to comply with rather than is true to the basic values. Hopefully, though, most people can be reminded and still have deep in their roots. Most healthcare, it's really the healthcare professionals. I think the administrators are a little bit more difficult, and that's who we're always working with the healthcare professionals to try to bring along those administrators. They're a little bit more fearful, and so we have to trod carefully, but we still do have to keep pushing for those values. We also wear academic hats. As academics, we publish things, we write things. And there we are truth tellers, right? We can be more prophetic in that way. I myself and several colleagues here, physician colleagues, and one prison patient advocate, have a commentary coming out, an editorial coming out in the American Journal of Bioethics next week. And the title of it is When ICE Brings You the Patient, Hospitals Must Stop Victimizing Forensic Patients. Notice that subtitle, hospitals must stop victimizing forensic patients. Strong language. And what we're actually saying in the editorial is that when Immigration and Customs Enforcement apprehends people and they pick them up because they want to detain them, potentially put them in deportation proceedings, sometimes the patient is injured or has some other medical condition that surfaces, such as in the editorial, we talk about a pregnant woman who was apprehended and thought she was going into labor and is brought into the labor and delivery by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement officers. And the upshot of this is that, suddenly you've got ICE agents in your hospital. They are fearful for healthcare providers and patients because they're often masked. I'm often not wearing identification. It can seem very gruff, and there's been a lot of tension between healthcare professionals. And what we point out in the editorial is the hospitals have actually been a big part of the problem here. We have policies that deal with patients in the custody of law enforcement. They're called forensic patient policies, and they're terrible. We never noticed this. We've been really doing a poor job for patients who are in the custody of law enforcement, whether that be people who are convicted and in prisons or in jail awaiting arraignment or sent trial. And these policies, really very often things like our security is supposed to come and brief the law enforcement officer on such things as what they should do. And they tell them things like you should keep your eyes on the patient at all times. You should handcuff one arm of the patient to the bed so that they are rendered harmless. And then these policies make no mention of patient privacy or patient rights in their medical decision making, which are the same whether you are a prisoner or not, that you don't lose your rights to make your medical decisions. And so these policies are terrible, and we've been still serving patients in custody of law enforcement before. We never really noticed it because it wasn't happening that frequently, and we just dealt with it as one-offs. But now we're seeing patients who are clearly very vulnerable coming in who have no history of criminality or violence, and we've got these policies that are meant to protect everybody but them. And so, we are in fact re-victimizing these patients. And so our editorial is calling for hospitals to change these policies, to make them such that they put in statements about patient privacy so that the healthcare professionals can tell the agents, we would like you to step outside while we do a physical examination on this patient. tells them about patient rights. And uses the minimal restraints consistent with the safety of the professionals in the room, which in many of these patients' cases will be none. And for many prisoners who are elderly or infirm who are coming to us, even though they were convicted many years ago, there's no reason for us to be shackling them to the bed either. And so, as academics, we can be more forthright in our publications and things like that and express that more visionary voice there. But again, calling really the professions back to their roots. How do we serve these patients well? Treat a patient as a patient. And so that prophetic part, we could be more public and again, push right on the edge there. Use some language that really, in some way, shames the system to try to do better. But in our institutions, we then have to go back to them and let them know we're going to give you our truthful, full advice, but we're not going to do anything to undermine your authority or anything like that. You're going to make a decision here as administrators, and we're going to do the best we can then to serve the institution once that decision is made.
Excuse me, I would think if you're, looking at some of those forensic policies that they're going to want the bioethicists to have some input into how we could rephrase them in a way that is aligned with the dignity of the patients, wherever they come from. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I think this is the next frontier that we all really need to engage on. We're too late to this party.
Yeah.
And Mark, it makes me think that when your answer, you basically said that the prophetic feeds the policy. We need this prophetic moment so that we can then draw out policies that actually do support the dignity and well-being of these forensic patients. And I think it seems to me you've already begun to navigate the tension, but also see how these the one leads into the other. There is a tension maybe that's there, certainly that's there, but they're not at odds, and they can actually work in tandem from one direction to the next.
Exactly. Exactly. I mean, we're good Aristotelians that way, right? We have principle, but in the end, the practical is where it happens.
That's right.
Yeah, we both caught your mention of practical wisdom early on in that answer, and we're all in favor of good Aristotelian Thomistic practical wisdom. Absolutely. Well, maybe another area of applying that practical wisdom gets into some of the language that is used not just around immigrants, but how do we talk about diversity within our own populations? And so, the language of DEI or DEIB, depending on how it's phrased, has sort of come under attack politically. How much do you see, as a bioethicist and in your work, does that language of DEI matter versus upholding other language? And here specifically, we could talk about language that has very deep roots in Catholic moral theology and Catholic social teachings, such as preferential option for the poor and vulnerable, language about universal human dignity, things like that. Where do you come down in terms of that debate right now, or how, I guess, Catholic ministry or institutions should weigh into that?
Yeah, thank you. This is an important question, and I'll offer a couple of thoughts. Maybe no definitive answer to it, but first, at least when I'm talking about our neighbors who are newcomers to this country who have immigrated to the U.S., I always really start with the human dignity terminology, largely because that word dignity, again, that the Latin for that, it literally means worth, the worth of a human being. Right. And every human being is of infinite worth in the eyes of God. Right. And, I think this is so important to remember that every patient is a human being that has human dignity, that has that worth. And that's what, again, when I talk to healthcare professionals, they get this. They like being reminded of that calling, that's what this is about for them. Meanwhile, the language of, our nation right now, our political discourse is so corrupted in regard to our immigrant neighbors. Where they're talked about as terrorists, as criminals, as people who eat your pets. It's all got crazy, and so this idea that we need to go back to the idea that people are people, people are equal, people are all the same, people are of infinite worth in the eyes of God, and that that term is dignity. They are vulnerable because most people are vulnerable some way, some more than others, right? But vulnerable, literally meaning woundable, right? One can land a wound because these folks are exposed in some way. They're exposed to excesses of law enforcement and over aggressive treatment and things like that we really need to try to help them navigate the way their approach to addressing that. The preferential option for the poor, very Catholic terminology, is good in-house speak. However, when people hear the poor, people who are not familiar with Catholic moral theology, they go to the idea that, well, immigrants are poor people who are takers in some way. They need us to give them things. And then they think, okay, well, uh, our country only has so many resources. Maybe we could do a little of that, but we can't have a lot of people coming here. And meanwhile, that's thinking of these neighbors as takers when in fact they are makers. And so I tend to avoid that preferential option for the poor language because, the actual narrative of immigration in this country, just as it's always been, is of young people, hardworking people, industrious, the best of the best, the brightest of the brightest, the ambitious people coming here, working hard, building the country, contributing to it. And so even though they may need some short-term supports, to get on their feet, to get, things like health insurance may not be immediately available depending on their entry level to jobs and things, they are actually makers. And so I tend to avoid that kind of language. That DEI language, though, it might be like sanctuary that even though people want to pillory it politically and turn it into a parody of itself, the words themselves are good words. Diversity, that we're all stronger because our differences make us stronger. We're more innovative when we encounter people who are different, and we have to work together towards a common good in our community. Equity, the idea that not everybody's got an equal chance in life, and we have to kind of have some things that help people get to the starting line so that they can then make their way themselves. Inclusion. I mean, who's for exclusion? Why would we ever want to exclude another child of God, another human being who has human dignity? And so we need to just really ask people, what part of that don't you like? And so I think that's all very good terminology, but in terms of the religious terminology, I think the one that just is easiest to get to resonate with people is the dignity factor. What do you guys think? I mean, do you think the preferential option for the poor can really help us out in explaining this to people?
Yeah, well, first of all, that that was one of the best answers I think I've heard in all of this debate. So thank you. Um, and I hadn't really thought before about how the language of poor could reinforce some of the negative social or political narrative around immigrants. Um, and I think the vulnerable piece maybe it creates more of an equal playing ground, kind of like your language around dignity. Like dignity is either universal or it's not, right? Like it's kind of an all or nothing for all of humanity, or it's not. And as you were talking about that, I was thinking about uh, anybody who presents to a healthcare provider in any form is already in a vulnerable position. And
Exactly.
so immigrate because something is not well that you're seeking care for, and then if you add on the comments earlier about immigration status being a social determinant of health, it's sort of like an added layer of vulnerability. But it is a place where we can invite people that maybe don't agree with how we want to approach this in Catholic healthcare to consider we all experience vulnerability, and that can sort of level the playing ground and remind us of our connection to each other in ways that might counteract some of the more violent language. So those are my initial reactions. But Dan, any thoughts?
Yeah, no, Mark, it's a really interesting point about the preferential option for the poor, and one that I hadn't considered in the way that you brought to us. When I teach this or I present on this, I think it does resonate with folks, but it takes some work. By that I mean, when I talk about the preferential option for the poor, I go all the way back to the Old Testament. And who does God choose? God chooses the world's weakest people, right? That's the covenant, is with the world's weak. They become entirely enslaved by the Egyptians. And then who does God become incarnate through? Well, this young, unmarried woman who's under the persecution of the Romans, Mary, right? I mean, and on and on and on, right? So God choosing the poor and being on the side of the poor, that God takes sides in human history. God loves everyone, but God does take sides. I think, but there's a lot of theological work that needs to be done then to get people to the point that, well, today, as we look at people who are, in your language, Mark, vulnerable, marginalized, but poor in a way, and there's multiple forms of poverty, right? It's not just material poverty, it's exclusion. There's kind of biases that can make you poor in a way, socially at least. So I think it does take more work. I think you're right. I think we have to choose our terminology carefully, and the terminology of dignity does land in a way for most people that other terms don't always. So, but you've certainly given me something to continue to consider. So yeah, appreciative for that.
Hmm.
So, final question here, Mark, is, who do we look to for leadership? Are there people, individuals, or groups on this issue of caring for our immigrant brothers and sisters, whether it's in general or in the healthcare system? Are there leaders that we should be following at this time?
Yeah, and I have a few different answers to that. One is certainly this is an issue on which the magisterium of the Catholic Church has been wonderful. When when I do talks on this for Catholic health systems, I always have quotes from Saint John Paul II, Pope John Paul II, as well as Pope Francis and now Pope Leo. And we often think of you know Pope John Paul II and Pope Francis as, one was the conservative pope and one's the liberal pope, and they're different. But I can actually play a game with my listeners sometimes and say, who said it, and give them a quote about immigrants, and there isn't a dime's worth of difference between them on it. That dignity of the human person and how that doesn't change when you cross a national border is something that the Catholic Church, as the universal church, really understands. And Pope Leo is continuing that tradition in a wonderful way, and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops has been a real prophetic voice on this, and the Catholic Health Association. Let me give a shout out, because we're all quick to criticize CHA when we don't think they're doing enough. But back on the first day of this administration a year ago, in January, the president rescinded what's called the Sensitive Locations Memorandum, which was directed the Department of Health and Human Services, I'm sorry, the Department of Homeland Security, to not conduct routine immigration enforcement in hospitals, in churches, and in schools, because these are places that are for other distinctive human goods. No reason to conduct routine immigration enforcement there. But that memorandum was rescinded after many years. And only the Catholic Health Association, among major professional organizations, stood up and issued a statement immediately in concert with Catholic Charities and the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, saying this is wrong and this affects the vital mission, vital ministry of the church, and that these locations should remain protected. So that prophetic voice was so clear when so many other organizations like the AMA were just absolutely silent. And now they're starting to get on the bandwagon. Now that the momentum's building a little bit in another direction, we're seeing the idea of the sensitive locations memorandum being included in the current budget fight that got the shutdown of the Department of Homeland Security that's being negotiated right now. So there's the magisterium of the church on this. In common everyday parlance, though, people who do economics and people who are economic reporters, journalists who do economics, are worth reading, because again, so many people thinking of our neighbors who are immigrants as takers, as people are taking something from us, who are living off our benefits and things like that. And it's the economists who are saying, no, you guys got this all backwards. These are the people producing the wealth that, in fact, the rest of you are pretty much coasting off of a bit. And so, right behind me, I have um, a book by a professor at the Wharton School at the University of Pennsylvania, Zeke Hernandez, called The Truth About Immigration. And it's a business school. He just goes through the business case of how much richer our economy is because we diversify our human capital. You know, the dignity, the worth of people actually, when we come and are diverse, again, that's word diversity word, actually produces a stronger economy. Now, I don't want us to be thinking of our neighbors just as economic engines, right? But we need to reverse that narrative about um, the uh, the idea that, in fact, somehow they are impoverishing us or being criminals to staff. And of course, immigrants, every wave of immigration to the U.S. has committed crimes at lower rates than U.S. citizens. They're busy. They've got things to do that rather than commit crimes. And I would also say that we need to look to history a bit because it's so easy to think the way we're talking now and the way this political dialogue has gone toxic is the way it's always been. And that there's always one party who's very anti-immigrant. These days, everybody thinks of that as the Republican Party. And there's one party that's a little less anti-immigrant, the Democratic Party. Not the way it's always been. It doesn't have to be. Because it's a human worth issue, because it's about dignity, and because these people are members of our communities who contribute. It's flipped sides over the course of history. We need to look to history. We need to think about how this has been seen in the past and about the mistakes we've made in the past where we've tried to exclude people, like during World War II when we were turning away refugees of Jews who were trying to seek asylum in the US. And of course, we didn't turn them always. Many came here and were great contributors to our country. And so even look to the sources in history that we think of as unlikely. You know, I always end my talks about immigration with a quote from President Ronald Wilson Reagan. You know, and Reagan, of course, the conservative Republican, he set the agenda for conservative Republicans for 40 years. But in his farewell address to the nation, the night, you know, the very last talk he gave to the nation, the last paragraph, he chose to talk about immigration. And you know, and he reminded us that how we see immigrants is how we see ourselves. You know, he had this metaphor of the US as the shining city on the hill. And we became the shining city on the hill because, and we're reinforced in that because other people were attracted to us. People who sought liberty, who sought opportunity, who sought religious freedom. They came here, unlike, say, the communist nations who he was always contrasting us with, that had to wall in their people. You know, so accepting people reaffirmed who we are. You know, and so he closed by saying to us, you know, I've spoken of the shining city all my political life, but I don't know if I ever quite communicated what I saw when I said it. But in my mind, it's a tall, proud city built on rocks, stronger than oceans, windswept, God blessed, and teeming with people of all kinds, living in harmony and peace. A city with free ports that hummed with commerce and creativity. And if there had to be city walls, the walls had doors, and the doors were open to anyone with the will and the heart to get here. That's how I saw it, and that's how I see it still. And that quote from him always chokes me up. And people know that President Reagan and I would pretty different ends of the political spectrum. But this is a human issue, and somebody who believes in the American dream and believes in us as a nation, as a God-blessed nation, should be welcoming to people of all kinds.
Well, Mark, it is a wonderful place to leave the conversation with the words of President Reagan. And so, thank you so much for your time and your insight today and for the conversation. We really appreciate it.
No, thank you.
Thanks so much, Dan and Tom. I really appreciate this opportunity.
So, Tom, it was a wonderful conversation with Mark. I hope the listening audience enjoyed hearing him talk about immigration in healthcare today in this moment of fear for so many of our immigrant brothers and sisters.
hmm
Tom, is there a takeaway that you have from that conversation?
Yeah, I can't help but be left with that image of the city on a hill which once he said it, I was like, oh yeah, I remember that. I was pretty young when Reagan was president, but I do remember it. um, you mentioned this context of fear, and I thought of the scriptural references where Jesus says in Matthew 5, "You are the light of the world. A city on a hill cannot be hidden." So there's a sense in which that imagery is very courageous for those, we're in a privileged position to be able to stand up and advocate for immigrants right now, for what's happening, to challenge current policies and practices and how they're affecting specifically, people who come into our doors seeking care. But that has broader social implications as well. And so that, I'm honestly inspired by many of the things that he said and that image that he left us with, and linking it to that prophetic vision. It's Mark did a great job of bringing us back to the founding ideals of our nation that I think we can all share, regardless of where we fall in the political spectrum, as well as to some of the founding ideals within our own tradition of Catholic moral theology and Catholic social teaching. So there's that looking back and then looking at the current situation through that lens. And then when we do that with, courage and integrity, then we can also allow a new future to emerge and live that out together. So yeah, I think it's a great call for us to continue taking those stands in a way that's appropriate for the different roles that we play, right? Both within our Catholic health ministries and within our communities and our culture. So yeah, I'm feeling inspired. Uh, and yeah, what about you? What did you take away from it?
Yeah, no, I was inspired by that as well. It was a moving quote, and we'll link that speech from President Reagan in the show notes so that people can read the whole thing and see that part that Mark quoted. What I thought was really interesting and important, and it's kind of a fundamental point, is that as we talked about the prophetic mode of ethical discourse and the policy mode and the tensions that exist, really what he said that we need to do is be reminded of the purpose of the profession of ethicist,
Mm.
whether it's of a healthcare ethicist, but you could say any ethicist, but obviously for the context of this community that we're speaking to and on Ethics on Call, that we are value raisers. We raise up values, and we try to ensure that these values are reflected in healthcare policy, and then articulate them in times of injustice when we need to speak prophetically. So we're always raising values in different modes and in different discourses and in different times. If you're in a boardroom and you're trying to create policy on, front door policies for caring for patients who are undocumented, right? We're raising values there. And if there are injustices happening in the hospital, we need to be more prophetic, and we're raising values and raising those up to remind folks, whether it's what it means to be a medical professional or a hospital system, just what it means to be a healer, or if it's calling us back to that deep and thick tradition of Catholic healthcare.
Yeah.
We're always trying to raise up those values. Um, and really to go back to something we always talk about is, what does it mean for us to continue the healing ministry of Jesus Christ today? And that's ultimately the value that we will be judged by as Catholic healthcare systems and professionals, is, are we living into that? And we should be reminded of that continually. And when it comes to immigrants, it's clear that Jesus, that welcoming the stranger was something we would all be evaluated on. It's clear in Matthew 25 that when Jesus articulates the works of mercy, that we'll all be asked the question, did you heal the sick? Did you welcome the stranger? And I think today's podcast gets at both of those. Did we welcome the stranger when he was sick? And did we heal them? So, yeah, that's the takeaway that I have.
Wow, that's beautifully said, and I appreciate the biblical imagery there as well. Um, Yeah, so thank you all again for listening and for joining us in this conversation with Mark Kuczewski. For Dan Daly, I'm Tom Bushlack. This has been Ethics on Call. Again, you can find our podcast on YouTube, Spotify, Apple, and our website, which is theologyandethics.org/podcast. If you're on one of those platforms, we ask you to follow us or subscribe to our page and leave us a 5-star review and comments or feedback about the show. That really helps grow the listening audience and give some of that social proof for others to want to join in the conversation. As always, we'd love to hear from you. You can send us a note on our website through the contact tab, and we look forward to being with you for our next episode. We'll talk to you soon. Thanks.